Good.
Oh,
That's
well,
all done.
move over and let Judy get on with it then, just a second.
Must be closer, isn't it?
Hmm?
Must be closer, isn't it?
Try that.
All right.
Yeah. Can you see Judy okay?
Certainly can.
Right, you're off then.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, very nice, kind, loyal people. Thank you for attending, if that's the right word. And I hope you're all well through this difficult, uncertain time that we're living in. Right, we're starting the reign of Queen Victoria, as you probably realised. King William's died and Victoria is now the new Queen. Just 18 years old by 3 weeks. The King had literally kept himself going with the help of his physicians. He'd actually asked them to do whatever was necessary to keep him going so that Victoria, the heir to the throne, would reach the age of maturity, which was 18 for royalty in those days. And the doctors managed to keep him going, and with 3 weeks to spare. And then he died. I don't say died a happy man, but he died fulfilled. He had been very nervous about dying before she reached the age of 18, because then her mother, who the King could not stand, he absolutely loathed her, Queen Victoria's mother and her advisor, Sir John Conroy, would have taken over with the Duchess as regent for her daughter. And the King was determined that that wasn't going to happen. So bless him, he got all sorts of things wrong with him. He was dying of all sorts of different things, but he managed to keep going, very brave, managed to keep going and give Queen Victoria a chance to become 18 and therefore Queen in her own right. She did not need a regent. So I've done a little bit of the background, could sort of say, using a modern phrase, the backstory. So Queen Victoria's father was the fourth son of George III. So really, when she was born, her chances of becoming queen were somewhat slight. So what was her father like? He was the Duke of Kent. His name was Edward. He was tall. He had been handsome. Like all the Hanoverians, he had a weight problem. They all seemed to put on weight very, very easily. He lost his hair while he was still young, which upset and annoyed him. But otherwise, he was seen as a handsome man. He was destined for the army, and he took to life in the army. But he gained an awful reputation that wherever he was stationed, he believed in the most complete discipline. He disciplined his troops way beyond what was actually necessary. And for any misdemeanor or anybody not following the rules or not looking sufficiently smart or got dirty buttons on his jacket, the slightest misdemeanor, he flogged them. He had them flogged till they were unconscious. You know, they had to be carried back to their quarters. He gained this terrible reputation for brutality. He was treated disdainfully by his father, and he felt very resentful about this. He spent a great deal of his career abroad. His father insisted on that. He didn't want him in this country. And of course, that built up a huge amount of resentment in Edward, Duke of Kent. He had we'd say now common law wife, but she was a mistress, Julie Saint Laurent. That was a sort of courtesy title. And they lived a very respectable life, although they couldn't get married because she wasn't kind of qualified to marry into royalty, according to the Royal Marriages Act. But they lived together for 20 years. There were no children. and it was a very companionable situation. She behaved very responsibly when she realised that after Princess Charlotte's death, the situation had changed. There was no direct young heir to the throne. That the sons of George III, really in their middle-aged men, it was necessary for them to marry somebody appropriate, German royalty, and try and produce an heir to the throne. Julie Saint Laurent retired on a pension. She was very honourable. She just disappeared and accepted the situation after 20 years. Now, the Duke was heavily in debt. That was something else about certainly the sons of George III. He was very abstemious and frugal, but his sons didn't seem to have a clue about money. They all seemed to get heavily into debt. They just didn't seem to understand that money didn't grow on trees. So he was heavily in debt. And so Parliament, as usual, said, we'll pay your debts if you do the honourable thing and marry somebody appropriate, which he did. He'd either got to marry a Protestant princess or duchess, or he got to marry an heiress who got stacks of money, and that would help him to clear his debts. Now, he was lucky. He found a very attractive well, she was in her 30s. He was in his 50s. He found a very attractive young royal widow, attractive looking. She'd already had 2 children, so she was fertile. That sounds rather a horrible thing to say, but that really was very necessary. And she was related. She was from the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha family, sister to Leopold, who had been married to Princess Charlotte. So an acceptable family. Saxe-Coburg's about the size of Warwickshire. So we're talking minor royalty here. But he didn't have to do what his brother William had done. Poor William had to keep proposing to various people, and they all turned him down. Edward was seen as a catch, and he proposed to this lady who was called Victoire from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, and he was accepted, and they got married. And the 10-year, the big age difference didn't seem to matter. And to everyone's astonishment, it turned into a love match. He turned out to be an excellent husband. He had actually been the equivalent of an excellent husband to Julie Saint Laurent. And she'd had a nasty first marriage to a husband who neglected her and had mistresses. And so she was absolutely delighted to discover that her new husband, her second husband, was very caring, very loving, very polite, couldn't do enough for her, doted on her, in fact. So they complemented each other, really. She needed somebody to care for her, and he needed somebody to provide him with children. So the problem with Victoire, she was very pretty and she was quite sweet-natured, but she was very nervous and excitable and not very bright. Very attractive to look at, but really not very bright at all, and needed a strong man in her life to tell her what to do and to advise her. Well, he was very happy to do that. So again, I would say that they complemented one another. She needed somebody to sort of help her with all sorts of things, and he was very happy to be that person that would help. She was lacking in judgment and hopeless with money. Absolutely hopeless, even more hopeless than that of England. And really quite sort of demanding, probably because she was so pretty. She'd been spoiled until her first marriage, and then reality hit her that there was a very unpleasant side to her first husband. So They were Queen Victoria's parents. She conceived very quickly, to the delight of the Duke, because it was now a kind of race to produce an heir. And the baby was born 11th of June. The parents married in July 1818, and the baby was born on the 24th of May 1819. So you can see they didn't waste any time conceiving the baby. She was born in Kensington Palace, and immediately the press got hold of the information. What was the baby like? Well, it was a large, sturdy baby. They didn't weigh them in those days. They just said they were large or strong. They didn't weigh them. There was a female obstetrician, very unusual. She'd been brought over from Germany because there was some fear in this country. We did seem to be very advanced in terms of knowledge of childbirth, which was very insulting to this country. But it was true that after Princess Charlotte's death, there was great nervousness about royal labour and delivery of babies. So they imported a German, unusually a female, because although they're called midwives, most rich people had a male midwife. It doesn't sound as though it makes any sense, because it should be a mid-husband. But anyway, they weren't called mid-husbands, they were still called midwives. And the Duke was delighted. People were surprised because they thought, well, he would have set his heart on a son, he would have set his heart on a boy. But he couldn't have been more delighted with the baby, described as a pretty little princess, as plump as a partridge, which is a lovely phrase. As plump as a partridge. She was a big, strong baby. And the Duke actually boasted to everyone that would listen. I mean, he was absolutely so delighted with this baby, and that his wife and the baby had come through the ordeal so well. Very proud of his wife, that she hadn't cried out and made a fuss. He kept talking about how proud he was of her. And he boasted that the baby was a pocket Hercules, not a pocket Venus. So a large baby and a strong baby. And people really needed to know that, because poor William and Adelaide had babies that had been born prematurely and had died. They'd had 4 pregnancies and had either been miscarriages or the babies had died. So that's why the Duke was talking so many times. I mean, to anyone that would listen, he was quite boring about the baby, absolutely delighted. It was, of course, his first child. It was her 3rd child. They were thrilled, and the couple together were thrilled to bits with their lovely bouncing, we'd say now, bouncing baby. And he kind of bored people talking about how delighted he was with his child, and no suggestion at all that he regretted that she was a girl. So all was set fair for her to have a really happy childhood. And everything did seem quite idyllic. The royal couple, although they'd not been married very long, were obviously in love with each other, and people thought that was really rather sweet. And everything did seem lovely until Victoria was 8 months old. And the Duke was boasting about how forward she was and what she could do. You know, how she was smiling at everybody, what an adorable baby she was. He then made a rather odd decision. He decided to go to Sidmouth in January, hoping that it would be mild, believing that it would be mild, and that the sea air would be beneficial, because in those days, physicians used to recommend seaside places. If people were ill, one of the remedies was to pack them off to the seaside. The sea air was supposed to have some kind of magical quality that you would recover from whatever you'd got wrong. You know, from galloping consumption to indigestion, go to the seaside. The sea air will do you good. So probably that's why he decided to go to Sidmouth in January, which turned out to be an absolutely awful idea. he caught a chill. Now, he boasted he'd never been ill in his life. The Hanoverians were tough cookies. He'd never, ever been ill. And he refused to follow doctor's orders, even though he came in one day with his feet and his legs all damp. He refused to change, you know, being very, very macho about it. He refused to follow doctor's orders. He then got pneumonia. And the remedy for pneumonia, well, the remedy for everything in those days seemed to be, there wasn't a seaside holiday, it was taking blood. If you got any kind of a temperature or a fever, they took blood. Just when you needed your blood to help you to recover, they were taking blood. And the story of how he was treated by his doctors is absolutely appalling. Absolutely appalling. I haven't gone into all the details. Different ways of bleeding people. They could either open a vein and then measure how much blood they take, how many ounces, and they poured it into a measuring glass or a measuring cup or a measuring bowl, which is a bit like cooking if you've got measurements on the side how many ounces they'd taken. They either did that or they could use what was called cupping, which was putting a heated glass or a heated bowl onto the patient, and then as it cooled, it created like blood blisters. It sort of sucked the blood up to the outer skin, and then it started to bleed. It was very painful. That was a very painful procedure. They wouldn't let him have any food. They gave him brandy, another thing that doctors reached for in those days to keep your, well, literally to keep your spirits up. They gave people spirits. They gave brandy. They turned to brandy as a remedy, treated it like a medicine. And he died on the 23rd of January, 1820. And it was a scandal, really a scandal, how he had been treated by his doctors. Lord Palmerston said the doctors were not worthy to treat a sick cat. It was a scandal. His wife, whose English was very poor, she wasn't very good at learning languages, and she'd not spoken any English when she got married. So they'd only been married a short time, and she'd not getting on very well with learning English. But with her broken English, she was begging the doctors to leave her husband alone. Even she, with her giddy, skittish sort of personality, even she knew that what they were doing to him was not doing any good. It was doing harm. She begged them to leave him to rest, because they wouldn't. As soon as he closed his eyes and looked as though he was going to sleep, they thought that was dangerous. No, he mustn't go to sleep. He'd go into a coma and then he'd die. So we must take some more blood, or we must keep him awake. The exact opposite of what he needed with pneumonia. So he was really killed by his doctors. The Duke's will gave Victoire, Duchess of Kent, sole control over. So on his deathbed, he recommended, this was another mistake, he recommended Sir John Conroy, who was an Irish ex-army captain, as the best person to look after the Duchess's financial affairs, because she was absolutely hopeless with money, hopeless. And that he would become her general advisor. This was a somewhat disastrous decision. And Martin's found a lovely picture of Sir John Conroy and the Duchess of Kent, Victoire. So this was a terrible mistake, because he thought he was doing the right thing, sort of protecting his rather helpless, hopeless wife, giving her official support. So John Conroy would support and help her. Now, the Duke had been told by a gypsy before his marriage, while he was still living in Canada with his common law wife, Julie Saint Laurent. Sorry, when he served in Gibraltar, sorry, not Canada. When he'd been moved from Canada to Gibraltar, he was told by a gypsy. The gypsy read his fortune, read his palm, and told him that he would be the father of a queen, and that seemed so unlikely when it was said. But he had referred to this on several occasions. He had told people. But after his death, the infant princess did gradually move closer and closer to the throne. King George III died in 1820. The Duke of York, the next heir, Frederick, died in 1827. George IV died in 1830. No direct heir. His daughter, his only child, had died in 1817, died in childbirth. William IV, 4 children all died, or 3 children died in the miscarriage. Victoria gradually moved closer and closer to the throne. And of course, eventually, the gypsies' prediction came true. And there are all sorts of legends, anecdotes, stories about how she was told or how she realized that she was the heir to the throne. And the belief is that she said when she found out, however she found out, I will be good. Now that's thought to be apocryphal. You know, it's all rather neat and tidy, isn't it? I will be good. Not very likely that a child would have said that. It's thought she was sort of 9 or 10. Some people said even 11, and that her governess actually left a book open with the family tree on it and mentioning the deaths. So the people who died were got a black underlining, and so the Victoria could work out that she was sort of last woman standing. Therefore, she was the heir to the throne. There are various stories about how she found out, and how old she was. So the stories vary. So, what was this child like? What was her background? What was her education like? What was her character like? Well, obviously, she never went to school. She had a number of tutors coming to Kensington Palace. The emphasis was on a ladylike education, such as musical accomplishments, dancing, and approved crafts, one of which was learning how to paint in watercolours, not oils. Oil painting was for men. It was seen as a very masculine, strong kind of artistic endeavour, using oils because they were sort of heavy. But watercolours, yes, they were sort of dainty and pretty, and the easel was quite small, and you could do quite small paintings, whereas oils tended to be big landscapes or bowls of fruit, or on a much bigger scale. So watercolouring was acceptable for ladies. The box of paint was quite small, and the easel was quite small, and you made quite small pictures. It was all dainty and appropriate and feminine. Victoria turned out to be quite talented in that direction. She was really quite a good watercolorist. She had very good tutors, and she was also good at pencil, drawing with a pencil or charcoal. Although charcoal was a bit messy, so it tended to be pencil. Really quite talented. She believed that she'd been left with sketchy knowledge of the world, and she didn't have a good education. It made her feel very nervous when she became queen, and she was with anybody very highly educated. She began to feel inferior, which was she didn't like. She often cut conversation short if she thought she was with somebody very academic or very knowledgeable, because it made her feel inferior and nervous. But in fact, she had quite a good rounded education, considering the protocol of the time, which was that women shouldn't be educated. It was bad for them. She did, in fact, have some very good tutors, and she did history and some geography and constitutional history. And she had very, very good people teaching her about religion, which served her in good stead. She believed that she'd been left wanting in some respects. It was only really when she met her husband, when she met Albert, she realised what a really academic education was. Her governess was a German lady called Baroness Letzen from Hanover. She'd had considerable experience of being a governess, and she recorded that she'd never met such a willful child. She'd never met a child with such a determined will to have her own way, and such a difficult child. That unfortunately, what she said appeared to be the final word on Victoria. She was actually saying that about Victoria when she was quite young, when she was very, very difficult in terms of wanting her own way and flatly refusing to do anything she didn't want to do. But that period passed, and she did become much more biddable, and she became so fond of Baroness Letzen, she actually called her mother. Pardon me. But Baroness Letzen, just Letzen she was called, certainly found Princess Victoria a challenge. Despite all her experience, she found the princess a challenge. On the positive side, she found her pupil to be very affectionate, and that she would say sorry for her tantrums. She would apologise. The other thing about Victoria was that she was incredibly honest. She would admit when she'd been bad-tempered. She would own up to everything she'd done wrong. She believed in honesty throughout the rest of her life. And sometimes she came over as really quite rude, because she said things as they were, not as she wanted them to be. She was educated alone, which was true of lots of royal children and aristocratic children. Unfortunately, she would have been better with other children. They would have perhaps teased her a bit, or she would have had to learn to share. She found sharing virtually impossible. There's an anecdote which is sort of backed up. It's not just a story. It's a true story, that eventually her mother did invite some aristocratic girls to come, a girl to come and be a companion, briefly, be a companion to Victoria, sort of invited her. And Victoria, Princess Victoria, was showing her all her dolls, her little dolls, which she and Letzen used to make clothes for. That was one of the things she learned to do, to teach her how to sew, making clothes for these little dolls, and then imagining scenarios where the dolls were real people to encourage her imagination. And she announced, these are my dolls, they are mine. You may look at them, but you may not touch them, because they are mine. It was very helpful for the poor child who was invited to come and play. You can't touch the dolls. So that sort of shows you how honest she was. Not bothered about being popular or liked. She just wanted to make it absolutely clear that they were her dolls, and that this young lady was not to touch them by order of the princess. Now, she would have learned to share if she'd been regularly either educated with other children, or other children brought into the palace as a playmate or playmate. She would have been better with more children, several at the same time, to, as somebody remarked, a relative, to knock any nonsense out of her. So even her relatives were commenting on this, the fact that she was very imperious because she was on her own. Now, Letzen devoted her whole life to Victoria, and Victoria responded with gratitude, sincere gratitude, and called her my angelic, dearest Mother Letzen, who I do so love. She wrote that in her journal. Now, the true mother-daughter relationship, so why did she say that? Why did she call Letzen her mother? Because that's somewhat over the top, even in those days where people were very, very sentimental and said things that we regard as a bit yucky in terms of affection, you know, completely over the top. So why did she call Leighton her mother? Well, she was a sort of surrogate mother, in actual fact. She spent every day, every hour with Victoria, and she was encouraging rather than critical. So what had happened with her real mother? What had happened to that relationship? Well, it became very, very difficult. Victoria and her mother didn't get on, because as Victoria got older, she was more and more restricted. It was called the Kensington system, and Martin's found it in your notes separately and copied them. The Kensington system, which was devised by the Duchess of Kent and Sir John Conroy, was that Victoria was to be, first of all, protected. She was to be told that her wicked uncles wanted to, well, certainly one of her wicked uncles wanted to be king, the Duke of Cumberland, and he was a bad person, and he was probably willing to have her put to death, and therefore her life was in danger. And so she was made to feel, as a child and a teenager, that she was made to feel paranoid that her life actually was in danger. This involved sleeping in her mother's room, in a separate bed, in a big double bed. She was in a separate bed, and the big bedroom, but she was in her mother's room. She didn't have her own room. And the other thing was, when she went downstairs or upstairs, somebody had to hold her hand. A servant had to hold her hand, in case wicked uncle had secreted somebody on this staircase to push her downstairs with the idea of breaking her neck and killing her, but it would look like an accident. And as I have fallen downstairs, I don't recommend it at all. It's a horrible thought that they persuaded the princess that this was a possibility. And so that is total overprotection. Until she was 18, there was somebody holding her hand when she went up and downstairs. I mean, talk about making somebody paranoid and restricting them. The other thing that happened, and this was partly the Duchess, very, very afraid of bad influences on her precious daughter, who was going to be the Queen of England. Now, the Duchess didn't know very much about England, of course. She was German, but she believed that certainly the aristocrats in England were wicked, wicked people. That they had appalling morals, or no morals at all, that they all had mistresses, they weren't particularly nice to their wives, there was sort of a scattering of illegitimate children all over the place, that the aristocrats drank too much, they swore too much, they were, well, they loved life, but they loved it too much, they were selfish, and they were immoral, and their children were exactly the same, and therefore Princess Victoria must be kept away from these very, very bad influences. There was nobody worthy of friendship with the princess, so, which is why she was kept separate. She wasn't allowed to have friends. She was lonely, very, very lonely. She was the kind of person that needed company. She needed company of her own age, and she was deprived of that. It was a deliberate policy. But the other aspect of the Kensington system was the role of Sir John Conroy, who comes out of this as a baddie, and other people thought this. It wasn't just Princess Victoria who loathed him. Other people felt that he was up to no good, and that because the Duchess was so hopeless with money and totally relied on Sir John Conroy to sort out her money situation, her finances, and deal with her bills and order things, it was totally in his hands. And John Conroy was totally in charge of the Duchess's finances, and therefore the princess's finances. And she was very willing to let him just get on with it, because she didn't understand money, she didn't understand accounts, and she didn't understand bills. Basically, she didn't understand money. Her maths was very poor anyway, so she just left it completely to John Conroy, which was giving him far too much authority. He was very much the boss. Now, his idea was, he was a very ambitious man, thwarted in what he believed was his rightful position in the army. He hadn't been promoted as he thought he should be. So he was now thinking that he could have everything he wanted by this connection with royalty, with the heir to the throne. He was going to be literally the power behind the throne. If he played his cards right, the Duchess would become the regent, and as she was pretty dim and very, very nervous, very highly strung, and very dependent on men to help her out, he was going to be that man. He was going to be the one who was really the power, literally the power behind the throne. That's what he saw as his future, and it was panning out pretty well. The Duchess was becoming more and more dependent on him for everything. And Queen Victoria absolutely detested him. There is a theory that Queen Victoria saw Conroy and her mother in a compromising position, and that accounts for her almost psychotic hatred of Conroy. There's no proof, but that's the theory, that it was more than just the fact that he was controlling her life and she resented it. There was more to it, that she believed that her mother was Sir John Conroy's mistress, although he was a married man with children. That's the theory anyway. That's what people believed. So this is why she clung to Lehzen. Lehzen was like a mother, a sensible woman, a sensible, kindly woman. No question of her having done anything naughty. She was a pillar of respectability, and taught Victoria to be similarly a pillar of respectability. So Lehzen stayed as the Queen's companion. She remained in post until the Queen had her first child. She stayed in post even after the Queen married Prince Albert. By which time Lehzen was becoming a bit of a nuisance. It was like a power struggle between Lehzen and Prince Albert for control of Victoria. And you can guess which one Victoria chose. She chose her husband, with whom she was passionately in love, and he could do no wrong, and she admired him. She thought he was, and this was the right decision, because Prince Albert was an excellent influence on the Queen. She recognised the fact that she owed everything to Prince Albert. So poor Lehzen was becoming really rather a nuisance. She was sort of clinging on to her power over the Queen, even after the Queen was a married woman with a child. And so it was arranged that she should retire and go back and live in Hanover. And really, this was very sad, because she had a lonely old age. She went to live with a sister who she never got on with particularly well. Desperate for knowledge of the Queen. And the Queen did write to her, but not as regularly as Lehzen would have liked. So that's rather sad. But Lehzen did bring some of the problem on herself. She didn't like Prince Albert. She was very jealous, of course, and felt that he was taking the place that she'd always had. She'd always been with Victoria. She dedicated her life to her. So it was rather a sad end to a long and noble career, really. The princess, because she had been, so back to when she was a princess, due to her strange upbringing, she was really quite immature in terms of not being worldly wise, because she didn't have much opportunity. to mix with people. She went on playing with her dolls and her doll's house until she was 14. We know a great deal about her because she had a journal. She was given a lovely book and a pen for a present. And writing a journal was a very popular pastime in those days, particularly for women, to keep them occupied, keep them out of mischief. And it was more than a diary. It had every, you know, it was like a little composition or essay about every day, what had happened, what she'd had for breakfast, etc. You know, very, very detailed. Not a diary, a journal. And she loved her journal and she wrote in it until she was, I think until she was 80. I think she gave up a few months before she died. She kept this journal. Unfortunately for the latter part of the journal, her daughter, Princess Beatrice, who took over really after her mother died, she'd been her secretary for many, equivalent of a secretary for many years, or her PA, went through her mother's journal and burned a lot of the pages. She sort of censored this journal because it was so very honest and outspoken and was talking very honestly about a lot of the politicians at the time. And she decided off her own bat, really, to destroy quite a lot of this journal, to censor it. But the early part remained intact because she wasn't meeting any politicians at that stage. It was a very innocent, what she'd done, what she'd said, and how people. Now, by this time, her mother was letting her off the leash a little bit. She was allowed to go to the opera, which she loved, and ballet, which she loved, and plays, which she loved. There was a chance to get out of Kensington Palace because she was always like a prisoner. So she was allowed to go to the theatre when she reached the age of about 15. And then when she was 16, her mother decided that it was high time that the people of this country met the heir to the throne. And so, to Victoria's great joy, she was allowed to go on quite lengthy visits. They stayed in people's stately homes sort of by invitation, but actually the Duchess was inviting herself. And Victoria was therefore allowed out, and she was allowed to sort of wave to people. And these tours, these visits were incredibly popular with the public, who, when they heard about it via the press, went to see her in their thousands. You know, huge crowds wherever it was reported that they'd be on the road or they'd be staying somewhere. Huge numbers of people, very eager, very anxious to see her, very boasting to other people that they'd actually seen the heir to the throne. This infuriated King William because she never asked for permission. She never asked whether it was all right. He might have said yes. He said she was sort of popping up all over the place because it was going to play on words. Wherever they went, there was a salute, a gun salute. Well, not wherever they went, but if there were any guns available, then there was a salute, which the Duchess loved, and Princess Victoria, who didn't like the noise very much, but realised that it was an honour that was being shown to her, came to accept it as well, her due, really. You know, she was the heir to the throne. She was going to become the Queen one day, and therefore it was her right to have gun salute. The King called it popping, the popping of the guns. So when he talked about her popping up all over the place, it was a play on words. He was very, very resentful, furious, in fact, that the Duchess didn't ask permission and that Victoria had been paraded around before his death. It was almost like, move over, sick old king. You know, you're the past. This is the future. That's how he felt. He felt that he was being sidelined, and that he was tactless, to put it mildly, not very diplomatic and tactless. And again, it was Conroy's idea. It had been Conroy's idea all along that, and he was always either there or he'd organised the visit and the itinerary, it was all he was doing. The Duchess really was incapable of doing anything like that, so it was down to Conroy. So the Duchess fell out big time with the King, which was very embarrassing for Victoria, because the King and Queen hadn't managed to have any children of their own, and Queen Adelaide in particular was very, very fond of her niece, wrote beautiful letters to her and sent her lovely presents, for which Victoria was very grateful. It was a lovely relationship, and she loved her Uncle William, although she thought, again in her journal, that he was peculiar, which he was. He was peculiar. She got it quite right, but she very much loved him and very much loved Queen Adelaide. But they certainly had a problem with Victoria's mother. Real antagonism. So what did Victoria look like? Well, what most people found was that she was rather disappointingly tiny. She was only 4'11" and she never grew any taller. So when she was taken out in the carriage on these visits, on these, well, they were called all sorts of things, but they really were progresses. They were a bit like Queen Elizabeth I going out on progress, meeting her subjects. She had to sit on quite a lot of cushions, or they wouldn't have been able to see her at all. She was so small. 4'11", she had very tiny hands and feet. People noticed things like that in those days. They hadn't got much else to do, so they were fascinated with how people looked. If you read Jane Austen, you'll realise it was very important how people looked. I mean, if you met somebody for the first time and you kept a journal, you would record everything, including what their ears were like, what their teeth were like, how their hair, well, no, everything about them. So the very small hands and feet were actually commented on. Tiny little hands, tiny little feet. Now she had, like all Hanoverians, she loved her food. She had a hearty appetite. She'd been a very greedy baby, and she turned out to be quite a greedy child, teenager, and adult. Loved food, especially sweet food. So she put weight on easily, and knew that it was a problem, but couldn't do very much about it because she just loved sweet things. She had Hanoverian features, high colour, a runaway receding chin, like her grandfather, George III, large, pale blue, grey, very pale blue, so grey, pale blue eyes, slightly protuberant, slightly sticky out eyes, pale brown hair, and a mouth that often stayed slightly open after she'd been speaking or eating. And her teeth sloped backwards. She had sort of little teeth. So when she laughed, she showed her gums. Her teeth were quite small, and her gums showed. And she did laugh a lot. It's not true that she was we are not amused, that she was straight-faced and sulky. She was she laughed a lot in her early. I mean, it was her bereavement that made her look sort of grumpy and upside down mouth. Lots of occasions in her journal, she actually writes, I was greatly amused, or we were greatly amused. It was a word she liked and she used a lot. And she was very happy a lot of the time when they were going on these visits, or she was going to the opera or going to see the ballet. She was happy and laughing, actually laughing. And other people recorded that her gums showed when she laughed, and that she chatted and talked even when she was eating. She was actually very sociable, considering her background. Sometimes she was ill at ease. I say she met somebody that she thought was very much her intellectual superior. She found small talk difficult, but basically she just liked to talk. Some people said she was pretty, and others, perhaps more honest, said she was plain. Everyone on meeting was amazed at how tiny she was. And when she ascended the throne, she actually wrote in her journal, "We are rather small for a queen." Quite sweet. The advantages she had on the positive side was that she was very graceful. Everybody noticed how well she walked, how upright she was. That was because one of the things they did when she was younger, and they did this to all children, all girls, they put holly leaves down the back of their dress, so that if they didn't walk tall, if they didn't hold themselves correctly, they would be prickled by the holly, and that meant that their posture became excellent, and in her case, particularly excellent. And when she walked, she seemed to glide. She on her tiny little feet. Everyone noticed how graceful she was and how she loved dancing, or how good she was at dancing, how she could keep time. And she absolutely loved the opportunity to dance. She'd been cheated of the opportunity, of course, because nobody was regarded as suitable for her to dance with. But when she broke free, became queen at the age of 18, one thing she loved was dancing almost till dawn. She would dance until 2 o'clock in the morning. After a time, she began to put on weight, and by the time she got married, somebody actually talked about England's fat queen. A bit rude. When she was 20. Now, I'm just going to end by reading some of the actual comments made about her when she became queen. Most of them very positive. Well, this is somebody before she was queen. Charles Greville, who was a spiteful man, he kept a journal. He was a sort of journalist, spiteful man. Charles Greville saw her at a children's ball given by the king and attended by the 10-year-old Queen of Portugal, and he thought that our little princess was a short, vulgar-looking child and not near so good-looking as the Portuguese. But that wasn't a general opinion. This is somebody called Lady Warncliffe. So Lady Warncliffe was delighted with our little future queen. She's very much grown, although short for her age, has a nice countenance and distingué figure, though not very good, and her manner the most perfect mixture of childishness and civility I ever saw. She's born a princess without the least appearance of art or affectation. When she went to bed, we all stood up, and after kissing Aunt Sophia, she curtsied, first to one side and then to the other, to all the ladies, and then walked off with her governess. She's really very accomplished by taste, being very fond both of music and drawing, but fondest of all of her dolls. In short, I look to her to save us from democracy. It's interesting, for it is impossible she should not be popular when she is older and more seen. When she did become queen, the accounts of her are glowing, because she was only just 18. She'd had a very sheltered childhood, and most people thought that it was going to be a bit of a disaster. How would she know how to behave? They were surprised at how well she performed. Even Charles Greville, who was known for being spiteful and critical, there never was anything like the first impression she produced, Charles Greville wrote in his diary, or the chorus of praise and admiration which is raised about her manner and behaviour, and certainly not without justice. It was very extraordinary and something far beyond what was looked for. Her extreme youth and inexperience and the ignorance of the world concerning her naturally excited intense curiosity to see how she would act on this occasion. I'll explain what this occasion was in a minute. And there was a considerable assemblage at the palace, notwithstanding the short notice which was given. And this was the day she was told her uncle had died and she had become the queen. At 9 o'clock, she had received the Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, talking to him, of course, quite alone. She kept writing this in her journal, alone, in big letters, capital letters, underlined several times, because alone was something she didn't want to have her mother and Sir John Conroy telling her what to do. Quite alone, as she intended always to do with all her ministers, and assuring him, as King Leopold had advised her to do, that she intended to retain him and the rest of the present ministry at the head of affairs, and that it could not be in better hands than his. She had another brief conversation with him before entering the Red Saloon for the council meeting. Going into the room by herself, quite plainly dressed, wearing black because she was in mourning for her uncle. So she had only just changed, only just been told. She'd been asked if she would like to be accompanied by the great officers of state, but she had decided to go in quite alone. And then that's the first impression, people. She bowed to the company, took her seat, read a short speech written for her by Lord Melbourne in a clear, distinct voice without any appearance of fear or embarrassment, then offered her hand to be kissed by the Privy Councillors, who came forward to be sworn, one after the other, following her two uncles, the Dukes of Cumberland and Sussex, and blushing up to the eyes, so Greville noticed, as these two old men knelt before her to swear allegiance. Her manner to them, Mrs. Kilgreville, her manner to them was very graceful and engaging. She kissed them both and rose from her chair and moved towards the Duke of Sussex, who was farthest from her and too infirm to reach her. She seemed rather bewildered at the multitude of men who were sworn, but she went through the whole ceremony, occasionally looking at Melbourne for instruction when she had any doubt what to do, which hardly ever occurred, and with perfect calmness and self-possession, but at the same time with a graceful modesty. Well, from Charles Greville, that was praise indeed. He hardly ever praised or congratulated anybody or anything. She was perfectly composed and dignified, though a red spot on either cheek showed her mental agitation, Lord Dormany confirmed, while the Duke of Wellington declared that, quote, if she had been his own daughter, he could not have desired to see her perform her part better. Her personality not only filled her chair, she filled the room. It was noticed with satisfaction that not by a smile or gesture did she indicate partiality, favour, or disapproval for any of the councillors who came forward to kiss her hand. Her voice, one of the Tory councillors, John Wilson Croker, said, which is naturally beautiful, was clear and untroubled, and her eye was bright and calm, neither bold nor downcast. There was a blush on her cheek, which made her look both handsome and interesting. And certainly she did look as interesting and handsome as any young lady I ever saw. So, golden opinions from the word go, the day that she'd been told that her uncle had died, which made her sad, and that she was queen, which made her happy. She behaved beautifully. And I'll just read this last bit. It was this is up to people to calm down a little bit. It was generally agreed that as well as being very short, she was a little too plump, and it had to be admitted, rather plain, with the protuberant blue eyes and receding chin of her Hanoverian grandfather, George III. Within weeks, a few weeks of Victoria's accession, the wife of Andrew Stevenson, the American minister in London, watched her at a dinner. Quote, her bust, like most English women's, is very good, Mrs. Stevenson wrote. Hands and feet are small and very pretty. Her eyes are blue, large and full. Her mouth, which is her worst feature, is generally a little open, her teeth small and short, and she shows her gums when she laughs, which is rather disfiguring. The laugh itself, however, Mrs. Stevenson decided on a later occasion, was particularly delightful, so full of girlish glee and gladness. And others also spoke of this pleasing, uninhibited laugh, and a voice which was and remained exceptionally clear and melodious. Her smile, too, was described as enchanting, and her deportment at once graceful and impressive. So, on that note, we'll leave Queen Victoria, having just come to the throne and receiving all these plaudits and all these lovely commendations in people's journals. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
I told you Judy liked Victoria, didn't I? Thank you, Judy. That was a lovely session. And we'll meet again next week for the final session before Christmas. And I at least will have a Christmas background. I challenge the rest of you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Martin.
Thank you.
Bye.
Martin, thanks, Judy. Bye.